This is the Kaviso exclusive Kirby Lambert Raine. Now, apparently this is part of the third batch of exclusives that Kaviso has done with Kirby Lambert. As far as I can tell, these are made by Riat. I missed out on the first couple of rounds. I saw them. I was aware of them. I never liked them quite enough to pull the trigger. And there's one big reason for that. I think the first couple of rounds had a recurve blade. Didn't care for that. Now, when I saw the news about the third round coming out, there was one feature that just screamed to me and said, buy me. And that was the so-called 80's carbon fiber. Now, as someone who was born in the 80's and grew up in the early 90's and watched many a rerun of 80's cartoons, I have to say, this speaks to me. I love these handle scales, and I hope to see more of this material in the future. That being said, I'm actually a really big fan of Kirby Lambert's designs. I've had the mini Crossroads for a while, and I love this knife. Now, this one is not really a user for me, but the ergonomics, the blade shape, everything about this design, I have loved from day one. This is a favorite. So I've wanted more Kirby Lambert designs ever since I picked this up. Not that there's a ton of them really out there. I have seen his work in person at the New York Custom Knife Show a couple of years now, but obviously that stuff is pretty expensive and not very available. So when I saw this one pop up for sale, I was like, I have to have that. Went right onto my wish list. I was a little bit slow in actually picking it up. You know, like most of you, I am budget limited. I can't just buy everything I see as soon as I see it. So this one came in a little bit more recently, and I have to say, I am not disappointed at all. Now, they had a bunch of different versions of these available. Different inlay materials, different finishes on the blade. You could get these with either a satin finish or a stone wash. I actually wanted to get the satin finish, but by the time that I pulled the trigger on this, they were out of stock. Only the stone wash was available. I don't really know if I necessarily would have liked it more with the satin. I mean, I typically prefer a satin over a stone wash, but that's just for aesthetic reasons. It has a pretty nice stone wash on it, so I am happy with it. And as soon as I got this in, I just had to sharpen it. Not that it was dull, but I looked at this blade and said, that one just needs to have one of my edges on it. So I'm trying to get the camera to focus on it just right. So there you have it. It's roughly a 16-degree per side mirror polished edge, and it is very sharp. So before I go too far down the rabbit hole, some size comparison. So this is a little over a 3.5-inch blade, I think. Maybe it's just about 3.5. As you can see, so the PM2 is actually a little bit longer overall, but most of that length is in the handle. Blade lengths are pretty similar. And I forget to mention this for those of you who are not like super into the knife world and are kind of newbies. So this is a 3.4-inch blade on the PM2. So it's a little bit bigger than your average folding knife. It could be considered a large size folder, but it's not very large. And then the Hogue Deca, which is a little smaller than this. So this blade has a, I think, 3.25-inch blade. It's a little shorter than the Raine. Handle is, with these extra large handle scales on this, the handle is about the same size. You can see you're looking at a large size folder. It's not massive, but it's definitely a large size folder. Reasonably thick blade stock. It actually has a very thick, robust tip. I have not measured it, but I can tell you it's a pretty chunky tip. And you can kind of see that looking at my edge bevel here, it definitely gets a lot wider out here towards the end. Whereas back here, it's a much thinner edge bevel. Hollow ground blade. Nice generous sharpening choil, which I appreciate, so I didn't get a smile back here. And unlike some of the other Riat made knives that I've had recently, there was no wonkiness to the edge. It was nice and even, and there were no kind of sloppy looking areas. I don't have any examples to show you because I tend to fix them as soon as I get them. The handle, so you see that there's I assume it's a black PVD, not a black DLC finish on the bolster here. So it matches the stone mush on the blade well. The 80's carbon fiber just looks super cool. It's an S90V blade. Forgot to mention that. S90V is one of my favorite steels. Great edge retention. Haven't personally had any issues with it rusting or showing signs of brittleness. I know that it specializes in edge retention, and it is stainless, although not as stainless as something like M390. Handle is nice and thick in this dimension, so it fills the hand very nicely. Feels great in this grip. For me, with, I would say, average-sized hands, I wear a large glove. It's perfect for me. You have 2 finger grooves for your index and middle finger. My fingers fall into them just right. Not the kind of handle shape that is really conducive to alternate grips, like if you're someone who likes to hold it this way or in a reverse grip, like so. I don't know. If you do that, you're a weirdo to me. But pinch grip is kind of okay. Pinch grips for me typically work better if you have something that's a little bit more narrow here near the pivot, either in this dimension or in this dimension. So since this one's kind of beefier in the handle, it doesn't work as well in a pinch grip for me, but it just feels so good in like this, I guess, ordinary standard grip that I don't care. And the jimping works well too. It's catchy, but it's not too sharp, and it doesn't really tear up your finger. Not that I really use the jimping all that much when I'm working with a knife, but I do enjoy the tactile feel of good jimping. So even where I don't use it, I still really enjoy it, and it still bothers me if it's not actually grippy. Action. So it means a thumb stud opener, it's not a flipper. And it is running on bearings. It is very smooth. It's not the absolute smoothest thumb stud opener I've felt. Not that there's any grittiness or anything. It's just that you can really feel that detent pull dragging along the blade as it opens and closes. So I did actually take this apart, and I did swap out the bearings for skiffs. It's not something I had planned. I took it apart just because I like to, sometimes when I first get things, I take them apart. I kind of clean them out. I put my own lubrication in. In this case, I noticed that the bearings were the same size as a pair of skiffs that I had laying around, so I just made the swap, and it did make it a little bit smoother. It had pretty standard bearings. I think it was an 8-count captured bearing. The skiffs are 11, so you do get some additional support there. And I did put some extra lubrication along the detent track. So yeah, that did make it smoother. Now, I've been slow rolling it in front of you for the camera, but you can actually flick it out as well. And you probably heard from that. It locks up very solid. It's got a nice thwack. I mean, yeah, rock solid on the lockup. And as you'd expect, perfect centering. I mean, this is basically the standard nowadays, especially from these high-end Chinese manufacturers like Riat, We, Bestech, right? I mean, if you don't get something with smooth action and just perfect centering and solid lockup, you'd be absolutely surprised. I guess that goes to show how far the knife world has come. When I first got into this hobby some 15, 20 years ago, if you got a knife that was smooth, solid, perfectly centered, that was like something really special. That happened pretty rarely. And nowadays, that's like the norm, even on a sub $100 knife. Kind of crazy to think about. Anyway. I'm trying to give you guys a nice look at this. I mean, I just love those scales. And I love the blade too. It's not, the blade's not doing anything really unique or special. It's just well done. And I like how the light here plays off of the stonewash finish. Yeah, Kirby Lambert. I wish we would see more Kirby Lambert designs, available. As far as I can remember personally, I've seen this. I've seen the full-size Crossroads that Riat did a few years back before the mini version, and I sadly did not get my hands on one of those before they were sold out. And I think he did another model with Riat, which is similar to the Crossroads. I think it had a slightly different blade shape. I don't recall the name of that one. Go look it up. But you don't really, aside from that, you haven't, I haven't seen many offerings from him coming from, manufacturers. And I think that's a shame, because I think that Kirby Lambert makes some great designs. Nice guy too. I had a couple of very short conversations with him at the New York Custom Knife Show, and I have to say, he is a nice guy. Very personable. Let me get this out of the way. No one will distract me. Yeah, I didn't mention before, so this also has a floating backspacer, also made out of the 80's carbon fiber. The fact that this is made out of the carbon fiber doesn't really do anything for me. I don't think that it adds as much cool factor to the knife as it does on these sides, because you can't really pick out the colors nearly as well when you're looking at it from this side. But the fact that it's floating does look pretty cool. So taking it apart, I can tell you that these pieces in here, they are just like little black washers. They felt like, they didn't feel like metallic. They felt like they were made out of like a plastic or a rubber or something. Maybe even G10. I don't know. So they're not really fixed to anything. You kind of put the pivot screw, not the pivot screw. Underneath the scales, there are screws used to fasten the two halves together, and they go right through where these spacers are. It's actually a little bit annoying to keep them all in place, because there's nothing to hold these in place when you're putting the knife back together. So a little bit annoying from the assembly standpoint, but definitely not the worst I've experienced. And the pocket clip works just fine. Machined. The ramps are done well, where this goes in and out of the pocket nice and easy, and it retains there well. And the finish on it matches the finish on the bolster up here really nicely. Not deep carry, that's for sure, so you still have quite a bit sticking out of your pocket there. Doesn't bother me though. And then the thumb studs match the bolster and the clip. One thing I have noticed, and you see this a lot more recently, is that, you know, on a lot of knives nowadays, you have much more embellished pivot hardware. Here, these are pretty plain. So for comparison, if you look at the Mini Crossroads model, there is this unique looking machined pivot with a collar, and there is, you know, it's Torx, so you're not stuck with some kind of weird tool to disassemble it. But this is kind of like the norm nowadays, especially on more expensive knives, is that you see these more elaborate or embellished pivots or pivot hardware. This one's nice and plain, and it's probably one of the things I did to keep the cost down, because these are only around, well, there's different versions, so I think they run between $260 and at the very highest end, $300. This is not the most expensive version. I think these were like $280 for this particular configuration. But, you know, typically when you're looking at something like this from Riat, you're looking at $350 to $400, maybe sometimes a little less, but you're rarely looking under $300 for a full-sized Riat-made piece with top-notch materials like S90V. Right, like, so I think, for instance, the one of their most recent models, which was the Tiger, the standard version of that was like $375 or so. And I think that the standard version of this guy was also somewhere in that range of like $380. Now, granted, there's a little bit more going on with this. You know, you have a unique pivot with a pivot collar, and you have a zirconium spacer. So here there's a little bit less going on, but is it $100 less going on? No, I think this is a good deal. So $280 is actually a very good price for something like this. It's probably part of the reason why, if you go over to the Kaviso site now, you'll see that they're either out of stock at this point or they have very few left. So, I mean, me personally, I would recommend this. If you like it, go pull the trigger on one before they're out of stock. And hopefully, given that this is actually round 3 of the Kaviso exclusives with Kirby Lambert, hopefully they do a round 4 with some equally interesting options. We'll wait and see on that. So anyway, highly recommendable knife. And to summarize again, great blade, good materials. I mean, fit and finish is perfect as usual from Riat. And I mean, I love those wacky scales. Highly recommendable. Go get one. Thanks for watching. Until next time.